So, history. What is the purpose of history? For most, I shouldn't say for most. In my opinion, because I can only speak about my opinions, history is a tool that allows us to understand how we came to the situation, how we arrived at the current state of affairs, so to speak. History teaches us about what were the steps, what were the situation, what was the environment, what were the dynamics between people, what were the events that led up to this moment. Okay, it's not just, what history is not, is taking this situation that we have now, looking back, and first of all projecting the current situation onto the past, okay? And then saying, this is why the past existed just for this moment to exist, okay? This is not how we should view history, because things in the past could have gone many different ways. The outcome now is not something that has been ordained. It is not something that has been inevitable, okay? And just because things are as they are now, it does not follow that the past is simply an earlier version of the now, so to speak. I'm sure this will become a bit more clear when I build a little bit of a distinction between history, what I call just history, like learning about the circumstances that brought us to the now, looking into the dynamics between peoples, looking at the complicated nuance that happen, like for example between countries, between ethnicities, between religions, and so on and so forth, right? It's a tool that allows us to understand the surrounding world much better. Now, we have something with the advent of the nation state, with the advent of the creation of the nation state, with the creation of national identity, came a need, I will call it a need, let's just say. There came the state wanted to create a new type of history. It would not just be called history, it would be called a national history, right? What is the difference between just history and national history? Well, usually the difference is that national history does not just set out to teach us what events led us to this moment. No. National history is interested in building a certain narrative around the nation. It focuses on the nation, it uplifts the nation, it builds a myth around the nation. The national history is basically how this nation came to be, and it sort of builds up the glory of the nation. You can probably start seeing problems with this, right? You can start seeing problems of a history that attempts, the main goal of that history is to glorify a group of people and to teach us about the glorious events from the past that led us to how this glorious group came to be here now. This sort of type of history elevates all the good, downplays or ignores all the bad elements in history. It assumes that everything in the past has been just simply a build up to a nation state. It does a thing that I think it's fair to call projection. It projects nationhood into the past, even to periods when nationhood or national identity were not a thing. So it frames conflicts between peoples, for example, in a nationalistic way, even if those conflicts were not based on nationality or national grounds at all, which creates big problems. Okay, it creates big national tensions when the events happened. That was not a thing. Okay, which is a big problem. Which is why, because we'll be talking about Ukrainian-Polish relations in this little thing that I've prepared, we'll be talking about the Volhynia massacre. We'll be talking about historical events and, in my humble opinion, discussing Polish-Ukrainian relations within the context of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when there was no such thing as a national identity, when there was no such thing as nation states of Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, or Lithuania. Those things should be discussed completely differently when talking about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they should be talked about completely differently when you talk about the newly emergent nation states after World War I. Especially since it is worth remembering that for this region of the world, there was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there was no nation state, there was no national identity, and under such a premise, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And you have to understand that the national identity of the people involved in this big composite state project of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, their national identity basically emerged and grew under the partitions of when being partitioned by free empires. That was the grounds under which Ukrainian national identity emerged, Polish national identity emerged, Lithuanian, Belarusian, and so on and so forth. And of course it led to, I guess I can just, with this little intro, I can get into the topic itself. After World War I, the three empires in one way or the other collapsed. Russia lost World War I, which later led to the revolution happening. We're not gonna get into that in detail. There was a civil war. Austria collapsed, or actually the Austria-Hungary Empire collapsed, and all the countries involved in that empire separated from. There was no more Austro-Hungarian Empire. That ended. And there was no, well, Germany was basically blamed for the entirety of the war and was suffering from severe, very harsh punishing reparations. And it was under these circumstances that nation states emerged, that people of certain nationalities, newly formed nationalities, declared independences of their countries. It was all sort of under the patronage, under the sort of watchful eye of the countries that emerged victorious in World War I. And the first thing that happened was that there was a clear conflict between the peoples that used to occupy the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The question, which lands of that bigger entity should go to which of the newly formed nations? Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania. Those are the biggest example. Like, which country should Lviv go to, considering that Lviv was primarily majority Polish, then Jewish city, but all the outskirts, all the surrounding areas were Ukrainian villages, Ukrainian settlements. We're gonna leave the topic of Vilnius for now. We're gonna be focusing on the Ukrainian part. And so that caused Poland and Ukraine to go to war. There was a Polish-Ukrainian war. And I'm giving you a very big TLDR because the topic is the Volhynian Massacre. I'm setting up the stage to the Volhynian Massacre just so we have a rough timeline of events, of what happened. Poland emerged victorious in that war, and Lviv and the surrounding areas went to Poland. Yes, Ukraine and Poland went to war shortly after World War I, because there was, as I said, there were disputes about which territories should go to which newly emerged nation state, Poland or Ukraine. Lviv was a very prominent example. It was majority Polish, and then of course it was also majority Jewish city. All the surrounding areas were Ukrainian. I really don't have a good response as to what should have happened to Lviv, because it was a very, very complicated and messy situation. I really don't. If you ask me, okay, what should have happened to Lviv after World War I don't have a clear-cut answer to that question. Okay. So Poland won that war. So basically you had that war. You had the sort of this Western little Ukrainian country that formed, and then you have the Ukrainian People's Republic that sort of formed, and that country was at war with the Bolsheviks, with the newly forming Soviet Union. Okay? And Szymon Petlura, the sort of person that was in charge of that, okay, so I have to stop saying sort of. The person in charge of that Ukraine made a pact with Piłsudski, the military leader of Poland, after the end of the war. After the Polish-Ukrainian War ended, Piłsudski made a military pact with Petlura to fight together against the USSR, the goal was to push back the USSR, create an independent Ukraine, which would be in a close military sort of this. They would be allied with Poland, and together they would be like this counter to Russia. That was the general idea. And Petlura sort of said, you are supplying us with military, you are helping us against the Bolsheviks, and in turn we are giving you these western lands to be Polish. We're Lviv, all that, you can have it as long as you help us against the Bolsheviks. That was the thing that was done. And the people of the western part felt betrayed by that, and they went and, interestingly enough, decided, if you're gonna screw us over like that, we're gonna go to the Bolsheviks, we're gonna join the Bolsheviks and fight against you. It was a very messy and complicated situation. I don't think we have to get into the nitty-gritty details of that. At first it was a success. Polish and Ukrainian army together went into Kiev. For a time stayed in Kiev, although there were problems there as well because Ukrainian people were distrusting of the Polish army and Polish presence in general. There was a lot of tension there because of historical reasons already then. And then the Red Army, the Bolshevik army, attacked and pushed the Ukrainian Polish army away from Kiev. Poland was pushed all the way back to Warsaw. The Bolshevik army, Stalin was there as well, by the way, was on the brink of losing, in which case Poland would have been overtaken by the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks were hoping to, from there on, spread the revolution to the rest of Europe. But then, as we probably, I assume, know, and then the Vistula miracle, that whole thing happened, the Vistula miracle. The Bolsheviks lost under, near Warsaw. They were pushed back, and then there was a peace treaty, which I would describe as Poland backstabbing Ukraine. There's no other way to describe it, I'm sorry. Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian sort of governing people were completely excluded from the negotiations, and the Western lands went to Poland, and the entirety of the rest sort of became what was known as the Soviet Ukraine. That is something that is very unfortunate, that in that moment when Poland managed to push the Bolsheviks back, there was no attempt to strongly fight for an independent Ukraine that would exist in that period. Unfortunately, Ukraine was betrayed by its allies, Poland, and we ended up in the situation where 5 million Ukrainian people were in the borders of pre-World War II Poland. And that is, we're not going to be really talking about the Soviet part. We're not going to be talking about we're not going to be talking about that, but we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the Polish side. The whole idea behind, because the countries that formed after World War I, they formed under the rule of self-determination. The idea was that all the peoples have the right to sort of self-govern themselves, self-determine their fate. And on that rule, the countries, the nationalities that were under the oppression of mainly the free empires that collapsed after World War I would be able to form their own countries in which they would self-govern. And there was the question, because of how borders formed, because how the countries formed, there would be a lot of minorities living within the newly formed countries that would not have really a country of their own, like Jewish people, for example. And there was an additional provision signed within the treaty that required the countries to take care of their minorities, to give them ample of rights, to guarantee representation, education, part in the government, stuff like that. And of course, that was absolutely not done, not respected for Ukrainian people in pre-World War II Poland. There were strong limitations when it came to education. There were strong limitations when it came to representation in the government. Poland did not keep its promise when it came to strong autonomy of Ukrainian people within the Polish borders. Ukrainian people were treated basically like second-class citizens. It was a very, very negative period in the history of the relations between these two peoples. And that, of course, laid the groundwork for, because I don't know if I have to explain this, but when people are oppressed, when people are being treated unfairly, when people are deprived of rights, when people are treated as less than, usually that leads to some sort of pushback. Usually there are two types of pushback, and that also happened in Poland. There's peaceful pushback, groups form, political parties form, sometimes religious groups form, which say we need to integrate into the system and we need to change things from within the system. We need to enact positive change from within the existing structures. And there were certainly Ukrainian political parties that even managed to get into the Polish government that worked under this premise of we need to, from within Poland, work towards Ukrainian independence. That is not really an aspect that is talked about when discussing this history, but it was definitely a thing. And then there was the other group. There was the other form of resistance, which was more extreme, more violent, more terrorist, I guess, in nature. More like assassinations, attacks, especially on, interestingly enough, on those moderate Ukrainian people that wanted to do stuff from within the system, and on Polish politicians that wanted to push for normalizing, that wanted to calm things down and give Ukrainian people more and more autonomy. Which, of course, the goal was to kill those more moderate Polish politicians, which would cause a very strong, violent response against the broader Ukrainian population from the Polish government, which would in turn radicalize the Ukrainian population more, which created this cycle of... But of course, these things did not really escalate as much during the existence of the Polish state prior to World War II, because those organizations simply did not have enough power to enact anything lasting or to make a big impact. Most of the people involved were arrested, and that was basically it. And Ukrainian people were sort of oppressed because of the violent actions of said groups. Everything changed in during World War II, when Germany invaded, and then when the Soviet Union invaded. And interestingly enough, all those moderate groups, all those groups that wanted to peacefully do things with Poland became immediately delegalized. They could not function anymore. They ceased to exist due to, I believe, the Soviet state mainly took care of that. And all the groups that were left were the radical groups. And long story short, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which basically was that radical branch of Ukrainian people fighting for their independence within the confines of Polish part of Ukraine. They created a militaristic offshoot called UPA, and that was basically the group. The day UPA and OUN more widely, I think their leader is considered to be Stepan Bandera. The ideology of we have to remember that OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, existed more. It was more firmly rooted in the Western world, the European world, than what was the case for Soviet Ukraine and the Soviet Union. And in Europe at the time, fascism as an idea was emerging and gaining popularity more or less throughout Europe. The idea of quick decision making, not being boggled in elements of democracy that led to stalling of implementing decisive action that would help people. That was like the fascism, believe it or not, found fertile ground in many countries in Europe to a bigger or lesser degree. And Poland was sort of kind of not exactly an exception to that. We could go into that, but we're not gonna super go into that today. And the idea that OUN and UPA professed was a very ethnic-based nationality. It professed that Ukraine, in order to be able to form a country, needs to be ethnically pure, so to speak. Like the Polish people would need to be gotten rid of, Jewish people would need to be gotten rid of, and of course allies would need to be found to be able to get that idea. Like there was this, especially since Nazi Germany sort of fueled those hopes for a time before they stopped, but that's an entire story, that's a different story altogether, that maybe through cooperation with Germany, Ukraine would be able to gain independence. That was the hope, which of course Nazi Germany has quickly shattered, because Nazi Germany has seen all of the people in this area as subhuman. So of course no form of Ukrainian independent state would have been ever tolerated by the Nazi regime. The whole idea of the Ukrainian territory, as it was planned out by the Third Reich, would be that it would be turned into the Lebensraum, into a place that would be feeding the rest of Germany. All of the Slavic peoples living in the area would be culled. The number would be greatly reduced, and those who would still be alive would be turned to serfs that would be working the land for the sake of the glorious Germans. Right? And that was, and it is under those circumstances that the Volyn massacre happened. The idea of Polish people needing to be in the context of non-existent Ukrainian state, I'm going to say that Bandera will collaborate even with Darth Vader if it would give him an independent Ukraine. Yeah, basically. Which, of course, Bandera was quickly disappointed because, believe it or not, there's a lot of talk. That's an aside, but I feel like I have to say it. Stepan Bandera was not as prominent a figure in history as he is made to be by both the Polish and the Ukrainian side. There are statues to Bandera, there are people that are angry at the statues of Bandera, but the sad, mundane reality of the situation is that Bandera, before the war, spent a lot of his time in a Polish jail, and during World War II, Bandera was fairly quickly arrested by the Nazi, and he spent most of his time in a Nazi cell. He was not able to do much. He was not able to be very active. The organization basically functioned without him. And he became much more of a mythical figure than the things that he actually did in real life. That's also a thing worth mentioning. That, and of course, he survived the war, and he then moved on to live in Germany, and I believe then he was assassinated while living in Germany. That's his. The end of his life was also not very exciting. He lived through the war, and then he just went and lived in Germany. So it was under these circumstances that the massacre of the Polish people in Volhynia happened. There are many different estimates as to the number of the victims. Let's go with the 100,000 Polish people murdered. A lot of them are said to be women and children. That is unfortunately the unfortunate face of radical nationalism, which, by the way, goes both ways because of the things that I've explained before. And then there were retaliatory attacks on Ukrainian villages, which is a thing that is less talked about. Like, not many recounts of history talk about the number of Ukrainian villages attacked and the fact that then the Polish army militants killed Ukrainian villagers. And yes, while I understand that the number of Ukrainian victims in those attacks was much smaller than the number of Polish victims, at the end of the day, it is not a numbers game. Like, let's not pretend that human life is like a scoreboard. Like, if only, quote unquote, hundreds of Ukrainians were killed, then it's worth less than like 100,000 Polish people killed. Like, let's not lose sort of track of the fact that I don't know how to put this. The fact that a single person dies is not less meaningful because more people of a different group died. Does that make sense? Okay? I think things like that should be condemned and discussed in equal seriousness and in equal sort of, like, it has to be recognized and not just say, oh, this number versus that number. because it feels like a very cold, statistical, and dehumanized way of discussing tragedy, if that makes sense. Quick question: Ukrainian nationalist movement and Poland interacted to some extent, but did Poland interact with the revolutionary insurgent army of Ukraine? Like, was there a deal between the two, or was that out of Poland's hands? I don't know. I would have to look into it, but I doubt it. I highly doubt it, unfortunately. And that is why it's very negative, okay? Like, I noticed that the topic of Ukrainian villages being attacked is not really discussed at all, because the number of the Ukrainian victims was much smaller than the number of Polish victims by the UPA. Okay? And just because the number of victims of a certain group was smaller, it does not mean that they were not victims and that their deaths should not be sort of remembered, that the violence against them should not be remembered, okay? It's like, again, it's not a numbers game. These sort of things are not numbers games. People's lives are not just numbers. Like, oh, if just a few of you died, then I guess your death is worthless. That is not how that works, in my opinion, at least. Like, it's not some nation scoreboard. It's not a game. It's not a contest. A lot more discussion is done around the thing that happened afterwards, after the war, the so-called Operation Vistula, during which a lot of Ukrainian people were displaced and or deported. That's the more broadly talked about crime committed by the Polish state of ethnic cleansing. That's also, could we say that the Polish-Soviet War was a prelude of Soviet invasion of Poland in World War II? We could, because Stalin had a direct hand in the Soviet defeat during that period. He was very eager to attack, and he was flanked, he was defeated, he was very humiliated during that Vistula miracle period. It is also a thing that should be maybe discussed a bit more. And then Stalin actually developed a little bit of fear of Poland, which is why some historians say that is why Stalin was a bit hesitant to enter Poland in 1939, and Hitler had to say, okay, either you go in or we'll just take it all ourselves. Also, Stalin was infamously not a very good military leader. He also fumbled years later the offensive on Kharkiv, which we could be talking about, but today is not the time to discuss the war between the Nazis and the Soviets. Yes. Okay, so we ended on an unrelated note. Why was Danzig not a Polish city, but administered by the League of Nations? It was an independent city. It was in its own independent city, and it is worth noting that before World War II, which is something, hence the name Danzig, okay? The Polish name for the city is Gdańsk, and the German name is Danzig. It is very worth remembering that before World War II, that city was actually a majority German city. The majority of the people that lived in that city before World War II were actually German. It was not a majority Polish city by any means. And before World War II, it was a free city. It did not belong to any specific entity. And of course, Germany, before invading, demanded that that city be made German instead of being its own independent thing. And also demanded that Poland allows to build an independent highway that would connect Germany to Danzig, or Gdańsk, if you will. Those were the two demands that Poland rejected. Volhynia massacre happened. Volhynia massacre happened. All those other atrocities happened after. And from that moment on, it became a big tension point between Poland and Ukraine. Okay, it became this sore thing between Ukraine and Poland. This sort of thing continues to this day, especially since as I mentioned, the person of Bandera has become very much complicated in Ukrainian history itself. Within Ukrainian consciousness, Bandera has become like this sort of divisive figure, more myth than man. Actually, when people think of Bandera, they think of more about the myth than the actual man, more about the things that are imagined that he did than what he actually did, because what he actually did was he spent most of his life in prison. And there's also the fact that Bandera himself, as I said, was part of the tradition and culture of the time of Western Europe, which embraced a lot of the fascist ideas. And we need to discuss the fact, because I feel like many people nowadays have difficulty grasping this. After World War I, before World War II, the world did not have mass media. The world was not as connected as it was now. We did not have information at our fingertip. When something happened here, we did not immediately have 15 articles writing about it, detailing it, recorded videos on what happened, live feeds, etc. That was not a thing. The internet was not a thing. I don't know why I have to say this, but it seems that I do. Okay? And that means that information flowing from one place to the other was quite a lot more limited. What was going on in this part of the world, and that part of the world, what was going on in Ukraine, the Holodomor, etc. Information about that was not as free-flowing to Poland as you might assume. And so Stepan Bandera, who was in that sphere where fascistic ideas gained traction, assumed, he was a hardline nationalist. He assumed that once he enters Soviet Ukraine, he will be praised, he will be greeted with ovation, that he will be fully accepted. And the reality of the situation was that simply was not the case. Like Bandera, UPA were not as extremely popular things in the Soviet occupied Ukraine as Bandera hoped and assumed that he would be. That's a whole topic of discussion. And the fact that Bandera is far less, it is also reflected in today, when there's much more sympathy to be found for Bandera in the western part of the country, certainly, than the eastern part of the country. Okay. And in the western part of the country, there is this whole topic of discussion about Bandera being more myth than man, etc., etc. There's a really good biography on Bandera that explains all this, that talks about all this. It's pretty fascinating. And so we now have a situation in which for years Poland has been sort of pushing for this exhumation of the victims of the massacre. Ukraine has been reluctant to make that happen. There's been a lot of back and forth as to the nature of the massacre. Poland says that it was a genocide. The Ukrainian side does not agree that it was a genocide. Actually, basically only Poland, as far as I know, classifies it as such, as a genocide. I personally don't classify it as a genocide. I don't think it was a genocide. There are several factors that come into the why I say that I do not classify it as a genocide. For example, one of the big, and there are a lot of people that will hate me for this, but it's a fact, genocides are not things that are performed by guerrilla groups. There are things that are performed by states. It is a state apparatus, organized form of a systemic destruction of a group in whole or in part. It is organized and performed by a state. Okay, UPA was not a state apparatus. A massacre. Not every mass murder is a genocide. Like, a genocide is a very specific crime. Okay? Not every massacre is a genocide. I call it a massacre, combined with ethnic cleansing. And of course there is the whole discussion of whether or not the goal was to expel Polish people from those lands, or whether or not the goal was to destroy Polish people as a group in whole or in part. That's all. We're back. We can go back to the topic now. So, we've discussed the history of, briefly, partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, formation of nationalities within partitioned lands, World War I ends, three empires collapse, new nation states form, new nation states fight over which territory of the old Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth should go to which newly formed nation state. Wars are fought. World War II. The massacre of Polish people happened by a nationalist, militaristic offshoot of the organization called, well, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. We have recapped what we've been talking about so far. And do you ever sleep? No, I always work. If you like what I do, consider joining lucyhaze.org/live and donating or subscribing, because I need funds to go to Ukraine again and do work related to kidnapped Ukrainian children there. So this is where we are now in the modern day. Polish politicians have been using this topic, and that's along the entirety of the spectrum, basically, of the political spectrum. A lot of politicians have been using the topic of the Volhynia massacre and sort of coming to terms with the history almost as a bludgeon to tell Ukraine, listen, either you agree to reconcile with this, or we will, for example, block you from entering the European Union, or we might not be as supportive of you as you'd like, etc., etc. I am going to be honest. I have a huge problem with how this topic is being discussed. I have a huge problem with the fact that this topic is being brought up now during the biggest war since World War II, during which the event has happened. And I think that brute force, forcing the other side to agree to A, B, C, D, or else is not the best way to conduct relations between two countries. I think that is just not the correct way to get things like that handled. And for example, Karol Nawrocki, the candidate of Law and Justice, because let's be honest, he was no independent, time and time again said that Ukraine should not be joining the European Union and NATO, and he also said that Ukraine must finally settle things with Poland when it comes to history, and kept talking about the exhumation of victims. Even though the exhumation of victims has already started, it is already happening, it is already underway, Karol Nawrocki in his campaign kept talking about it as if it was not happening, and that also kind of infuriates me. But that is not even the main point, okay? The main point is that, in my opinion, this topic should not be done right now in the middle of a war, okay? This whole thing should not be dredged out in the right now. Like, there are many people that are saying, oh, that's great that the bodies are being excavated right now and that this thing is getting taken care of and settled. Well, I'm not happy that this thing is getting settled and that the exhumation of bodies are happening right now. I'm actually not happy at all. I'm the opposite of happy about that. I'm sure this will be, especially when it comes to the Polish part of my audience, this will be not taken well, but I'll give you an example. Did you know that Ukraine, in the far eastern parts of the country, needs excavators badly to dig trenches, to help build fortifications, all these things that help keep people alive? Did you know that there's a shortage of these things? Did you know that private initiatives gather money to buy more of these things that could be used for such construction efforts? And what am I supposed to feel and think when those machines that could be used for such construction is now being used for the exhumation of bodies? I don't like it. I don't like the discussion surrounding this topic. I don't like the fact that it is being done right now. I feel like this whole discussion should be paused. I feel like this discussion should be brought up after the war, during peacetime. I feel like the negotiations about exhumation should be happening in peacetime. I feel like the historical discussions any sort of discussions on this topic should not be happening during the biggest world war since World War II. So, as we've established, I am not a big fan of how the Volhynia massacre is being discussed in between Poland and Ukraine right now. I actually don't like the fact that Ukraine uses the term tragedy. It was not a tragedy. It was not something that was stumbled onto by mistake. It was a pretty deliberate act. And also, I don't like the fact that Poland uses the topic as a bludgeon right now, basically saying during this war, if you want continued support, if you want to join the European Union, if you want this, if you want that, or if you want the other, then you better listen to our demands right now when it comes to this historical event. You better start the exhumation right now. You better do this, that, and the other. Okay, I don't like that. This is not, I've already said it, this is not the way to conduct international relations in a productive way. Not at all. And this whole situation, this whole thing should wait till after the war to be addressed properly. That is my opinion. Okay? Alright. Especially since this is very much a topic that is actively used by Russia, and let's not even pretend that it's not the case. It is very much a topic that is actively used by Russia to attempt to throw a wedge between Poland and Ukraine and to sever that link, or at least weaken it, in order for Russia to have an easier time in Ukraine. That is also a very strong element of the whole puzzle. I think it is important to do this whole long intro, because otherwise you will end up like Vosh, who says, Volhynia, what was that? Was it when the Nazis killed them? Was it done by the Ukrainian branch of the SS? So in order to avoid that sort of miscommunication, I decided to do a whole long entry into the topic. So this takes us to today. Poland has officially declared July 11th a National Day of Remembrance Day for the Polish victims of genocide by Ukrainian nationalists, prompting a critical response from Ukraine. Maybe soon. Okay, this has happened. The Polish parliament has declared July 11th as a National Day of Remembrance Day for the Polish victims. This has not just sparked a critical response from Ukraine. This has sparked a whole conversation online. Okay, this has sparked a whole conversation from Ukrainian people, from Polish people, Ukrainian people saying that it's bullshit, that the number of victims is being overblown, that it was not as bad. Polish people saying that it was the worst, and that actually Ukraine should be abandoned because it sucks. It created a whole thing, which, by the way, I took part in, because I'm not going to get into it. I'm not interested in interpersonal drama. There's a wider point to be made. But I did, in fact, take part in the discussion. Dr. Johns liked my tweet. So Dr. Johns knows what I'm talking about. The thing is, as much as I am pretty much in favor of a day that would commemorate the victims of a massacre, I'm definitely not against that. I think that when tragedies happen, we have to give these tragedies respect. We have to commemorate these tragedies. But I also, once again, have to go back to the fact that I do not like that these things are being done right now during the biggest war since World War II. And I do not like the fact that Poland, and this is actually going to be a whole second segment of today, has a very selective historical memory of what should be commemorated or what should not be commemorated, and the timing of establishing certain commemoration. Okay? This is something that is particularly a thing that irks me. Okay? I will be discussing this after I finish this. The response from Ukraine was, and I don't particularly like the response from the Ukrainian government side either. Statement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine considers the decision of the Sejm of the Republic of Poland to establish 11th July as a day of remembrance for the victims of the so-called genocide committed by the OUN and UPA in the eastern territories of the Second Polish Republic to fly in the face of the spirit of good neighborly relations between Ukraine and Poland. I don't like the language used by this response. I don't like the usage of the so-called genocide, because like whether or not it was a genocide is a discussion that can be had. I personally do not classify it as such, but it does not. I think that it's that writing in an official reply so-called genocide is unnecessary, personally. And I also feel like the aggressive tone in response to creating a Commemorance Day for the victims it does not really help resolve the issue. It does not really help resolve the issue. Even though, at large, I think that this topic should not be discussed at all during the war. I feel like these topics should be discussed after the war when there is peace. And I feel like Poland has been making a mistake in pushing this issue right now as aggressively as it has. I'm really not a big fan of this whole thing from all sides involved. But I'm especially critical of Poland when it comes to this, when it comes to handling of the issue and the timing of the handling of the issue. I'm critical. And so we have the Volhynia massacre. I have here the page that explains the history of it. And of course there's one interesting thing that I would like to mention. There's this page called thevolhyniamassacre.eu, and there's an aspect that is, interestingly enough, it has been highlighted by the IPN, Institute of National Remembrance, that there is actually a list of the Ukrainian righteous, which is an aspect also that is not discussed a lot in this whole thing. According to a range of testimonies, many Ukrainians helped their Polish neighbors whose lives were in danger. That help assumed the following forms: warnings about attacks, showing an escape route during an attack, sheltering Poles before unexpected attack, misleading the attackers, the provision of first aid to wounded Poles, the provision of food or clothing to survivors, taking care of orphans and children lost after attacks, helping to bury the victims, refusal to carry out an order to kill a Polish member of one's own family, refusal to participate in an attack because, yes, Ukrainian and Polish people, by the very fact of proximity, formed families together. I don't think that's a thing that should shock anybody. Public protest, sparing the lives of Poles and the release of arrested Poles. Even though it is difficult to estimate the scale of this help, it was real. In 500 localities of the eastern borderlands examined in this regard, massacres occurred in over 2,000 localities. The OUN UPA killed approximately 20,000 Poles. Ukrainian acts of solidarity and mercy saved both individuals and populations of entire villages, several thousand people in total. Over 1,300 Ukrainians are documented as having helped Poles to a lesser or greater extent. Ukrainian nationalists killed several hundred of the righteous as punishment for all manifestations of friendliness towards Poles. Were regarded for all manifestations of friendliness towards Poles were regarded as acts of collaboration with the enemy and betrayal of national ideals, and that called for merciless revenge. So this is another aspect that is very often not discussed in this whole history. Like, as I've said, okay, we have, so this is another aspect that there is another thing, okay? OUN, UPA were very extremist, nationalist groups, okay? They did not tolerate Ukrainian people that did not fall onto the idea of nation and nationality that they believed in. OUN and UPA very much persecuted and killed any Ukrainian people that did not, so to speak, fall in line with their modus operandi, with their sort of idea of what the Ukrainian nation was and what it had to do to achieve an independent Ukraine. Which is why, let's just say that OUN and UPA were not extremely popular organizations in the East. They were not. And to this day, OUN and UPA are not remembered with fondness in eastern Ukraine. So, to summarize, because I feel like the build-up, like the explaining of the circumstance that brought us here, took a lot more than actual explanation of the current situation, which I don't have a problem with that. I feel like we are in this mess because I really blame Poland more than anything for this, because I really feel like difficult history, painful history should be discussed between two countries as two equal groups, as two sort of as equals, right? And it is basically impossible for this topic to be discussed in a calm and constructive manner and as two equal parties when one of the parties is in the middle of fighting a war of survival that is the biggest war since World War II. Like, I cannot overlook this aspect. I simply cannot. That this is being pushed, this right now in particular, when I think that it should absolutely not. Like, this is a point that will sound like, I hope that this will encapsulate what I'm trying to say. And I feel like it's a very, very bad thing that bodies are being excavated, bodies are being exhumed, using equipment that instead could be used to save the lives of people that that are alive right now. That like people could be saved using this equipment, and I feel that it's really, really bad. To, as important as memory is not more important than protecting the lives of those that are still with us today. I feel like the priority should be to use all means, all equipment, everything at the disposal of Ukraine to build those trenches, build those fortifications in order to save the lives that can be saved right now. And to be blunt, memory can be discussed later. History can be discussed later. There's a very, very pressing threat right now that should be the absolute priority. Dr. John says, but Lucy, what's more important than settling a century-old grudge? I mean, protecting the lives of Ukrainian people against the genocidal invasion of Russia would be one thing that comes to mind, but there might not be a Ukraine to apologize in the future. Poland won't get a sorry if Russia wins. Like, this is... I hate this. I hate the discussion surrounding it. And the discussion surrounding it is basically that there are people that are saying that Polish people are the worst because they voted in a Yanukovych type guy, which I agree, sort of. He is a Yanukovych like guy. And that Polish people only are pro-Ukraine because they hate Russia more, and otherwise they would be just anti-Ukraine. That's... I'm sorry, that is not a generalization that I can get behind. That is not something that I can sort of agree to. And also, I do not agree with the people that say, oh, Ukrainians are only just want to deny and demand help. That's not the case, okay? If anything, I can say that when discussions like this happen around the topic, all I can conclude is that Russia is succeeding. That is exactly what Russia wants, okay? To build tension around this topic. And that is also an additional reason why I think that this should not be discussed right now, during the war. I'm not even sure what else to add. Like, if there's anything else, then I will probably talk about it again, but I think someone here said it best. Like, settling a century-old grudge should not be more important than supporting Ukraine and defending itself against a genocidal invasion. And exhuming, like the exhumation of the bodies of victims should not be prioritized right now over the helping of those who are alive today. This is not the time. This is not the time. And I'm not even going to mention the fact that these discussions should not be so one-sided. Poland should, absolutely, there should be a discussion on what led to the creation of those extremist nationalist groups in pre-World War II Poland, what Poland did before World War II. There should be a discussion about the post-World War II Operation Vistula. All those things should be discussed honestly and with everything that it entails included. We should be discussing history. We should not be discussing national history, which I'm going to wrap this up by going back again to the idea of learning and discussing history, and learning and discussing national history. National history being about glorifying a certain group, only talking about successes, talking about how this group was destined to be the way it is, how all of the history was just a build-up to this nation existing, how there was nothing ever that could blemish the perfect image of the nation. That is the national history. That is what nation states try to often push. That is what nation states try to create as the history that people should learn. And that leads to the inability to discuss history. And that is how did it happen that we arrived where we are right now. And history does not care about the glory of the nation. History does not care to favor specific groups over the others. History does not care as a subject, as a discipline, because of course history does not have a will of its own. We should be discussing history. We should not be discussing national history, because that is often a dead end in my opinion.